It is a great, great pleasure for us here at Casa Italiana to present this monumental work tonight here, outside in, the oral history of Guido Calabresi by Norman Silber. Judge Calabresi has been here before, and the previous time he was here was for the presentation of Gianna Pontecorboli's book about Italian Jewish immigrants during, refugees more precisely, during World War II. And the judge was here as a guest of honor to talk about his own experience. And that time, within the many things that the judge said, he ended with a sentence. Then I discovered it's a sort of a mantra for the judge, and I found it at the very beginning of the book we are presenting tonight. And it's a sentence that says more or less, I am the judge that I am, and I'm the scholar that I am, because I am an immigrant and a refugee. It's a sentence that impacted me very strongly from a personal point of view. And I've been thinking about it very often after I heard it, trying to understand what the judge meant. And I know that he calibers his words carefully, and he uses the present in both instances when he says, because I am an immigrant and I am a refugee. He doesn't say I was. And being an immigrant, not a refugee myself, I thought about what that means. How does that change our life and our perception of life, social issues, political issues? And in this book, I found the answer to many of the questions that derive from that statement of Judge Calabresi. And my job here tonight is simply to coordinate things a little bit and to introduce our guest. And I'm not going to say much because we have a very good website. And if you want the entire bibliography and biography of our guest, you can look it up. And I want to leave as much time as possible to listen to their voices. Norman Silber is a professor of history and also professor of law. And one of his specialties is oral history. And I think in these volumes, you have one of the proofs of the way in which he does oral history. And I asked him to start his remarks with a little methodological premise in regard to what is oral history, a definition of it, and specifically the way in which you intended and the way in which you applied it in the book about Judge Calabresi. Judge Calabresi, I'm not even going to try to give you a short biography of Judge Calabresi. This is just a small part of his biography. So suffice to say that he is the judge for the U.S. Court of Appeal for the Second Circuit here in New York. And he was for many years dean of the Yale Law School, for which he still teaches. And I met many of his students, and I have to say that all of them, as soon as they hear the name, they are in awe, and you see their eyes lighten up, like when you talk to you about one of your great teachers. And I discovered in the book that his conversion to teaching, when he understands that that's his calling, and he got it right. So about Judge Calabresi, I just want to say he's a maestro in Italian. That's the name. It's a maestro, and you use it for your elementary school teacher, and you use it for Michelangelo, and you use it for a conductor of an orchestra. That's what he is. To make a very long biography in one word, maestro. And we have Alessandro Cassin, who is the director of publishing at the Centro, Primo, Levi, and I thank him and Natalia Andrimi for all the work that we do together. And it's always for exciting projects like the one we are presenting here tonight. And I think Alessandro is going to go right after me, and then we're going to go back and listen to our guest. Alessandro.
Thank you, Stefano, and good evening. I will try to be brief. It's a really great pleasure and honor for me to present Outside In, the oral history spanning from 1932 to 2022 of Guido Calabresi, his life and work, written with Professor Norman Silber. Our culture landmarks buildings and assigns statue of natural treasure to parks. Yet we do not treat the same way outstanding individuals. I consider Judge Guido Calabresi a national treasure and believe that a reader with no previous knowledge of this man will come to a similar conclusion. I will not attempt to summarize the more than 800 pages of his work, but I would like to emphasize a few aspects. The US can be seen as a large-scale experiment in constructing nationhood through immigration. This is a country of immigrants. The struggles, challenges, and rewards of the immigrant experience have yet to be studied sufficiently from the inside, not as sociology, but as personal experience. Guido's reflection on his life and career are steeped in this experience. He arrived in New York on September 16, 1939. He was 6 years old and suddenly found himself an immigrant, the son of immigrant parents. From then on, despite feeling like an outsider, and perhaps in part because of it, he has excelled in his work as scholar, as educator, and later senior judge in the United States Courts of Appeals for the Second Circuit. I want to quote precisely what Stefano was referring to, which is in his very opening of the introduction. One cannot understand my opinions as judge, my actions as dean, or even my scholarship, if one does not also understand the degree to which my background, my Italian and my Italian Jewish roots have influenced my life and work. This is a remarkable statement, as is the trajectory that has brought Guido Calabresi to redefine his identity. Let me explain. In the eyes of others, the Calabresi family arriving in New Haven in January 1940 was quite unclassifiable. They were recent immigrants struggling for money, yet highly cultured and sophisticated. They were Jewish but recently baptized. They did not fit in with the local Jewish population, nor with the Italian Americans in town. And yet they found a place through resilience, self-assuredness, hard work, and the opportunities offered them by Yale. So much so that in his struggle to define his experiences, Guido comes up with another extraordinary statement. We were ethnically Yale. In these few words, he acknowledges how identity is a social construct, not at all a rock-solid given. He and his parents realized that in the new world they could, and to a large degree, had to reinvent themselves in fundamental ways. The second topic I'd like to point out concerns Guido's birth, in the broadest possible sense. The readers will learn that he is the child of Bianca Finzi-Contini and Massimo Calabresi, and we will learn about the grandparents and the ancestors. On both sides, 4 illustrious Jewish-Italian families, the Finzi-Continis, the Calabresis, the Minerbis, and the Del Vecchio. But on another level, Guido and his brother were also born from an injustice, an unappealable injustice, the fascist racial laws, an injustice that denied them, through a criminal rule of law, their human rights, status, and way of life. Of course, this may be my personal reading of a book. Still, page after page, as Guido explores and explains his career, I cannot help feeling that a conscious or unconscious motivation in his life work has been that of upholding the rule of law against all injustice, deriving from that primal injustice. I have one more remark regarding his tracing the life of his ancestors. The stories, anecdotes, reflection make it a compelling, sometimes humorous, sometimes tragic tale. With its wealth of information, it is an expression of a writer's unique position. As I mentioned, Guido was 6 years old when he arrived here, so his experience and recollections of the world they left are a combination of the impression of a child, what he was later told at home, and what he learned during a lifetime of interest in family and history, not to mention trips back to Italy. What is extremely precious is the perspective of a family who had been largely cut off by the war from those who remained, and from the horrors of persecution. They tried as best they could to learn and comprehend, with all the emotional burden that the process entails. It is an invaluable and detailed testimony of a particular family experience. It is not and it does not attempt to be a report on what happened to the Jews in Italy. I will explain why I think this distinction is so essential. Italy is a recent country, unified only in 1861, so deep regional differences remain to this day in all sectors of society and inevitably among the Jews. Until fascism, there was no unified Italian Judaism, and local communities often had very different liturgical and social practices. So, for example, Jewish laws prescribes burial and prohibits cremation, so that when Guido describes the untimely death of his grandfather, Ettore Calabresi, in 1937, his being cremated and his ashes held in the Jewish cemetery in Ferrara, we are not to assume that this was common customary practice among Italian Jews. What I mean is what was slipped by one rabbi in Ferrara may well have regarded as unacceptable by rabbis in Venice or Rome. Or the broader assertion which Guido makes that Italian Jews were largely non-practicing and that Judaism for them was no longer something about religion. This may have been true in certain families, milieus, in certain regions, among certain classes, but it's very complicated and problematic to generalize. In other words, this section must be read with the understanding of the intrinsic difficulty of reconciling a specific family experience with a more complex and plural concept of history. This volume, on which we're mainly concentrating tonight, the first volume, also tells us about Guido Calabresi's fantastically rich adventure in education. First as a student in high school, then at Yale, as a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford, and finally at the law school. He was not just an excellent student, but one who saw education as a mind-expanding opportunity. The intellectual stimulation he received from his teachers is the basis of his passion, which in turn made him a famed professor and eventually the dean of Yale Law School. He chose his role as an educator over the tempting sirens of law practice, banking, economics, government, all careers that were open to him. I hope he will elaborate on the roads not taken. I must mention that at the heart of his legal interest, there was always from the beginning the interplay between law and economics, understood from the perspective of the values of social justice and democracy. We learn about his meeting, courtship, and marriage with Anne Gordon Audubon Tyler, and of all that their long, loving marriage means to him, about the articles and books that he wrote, about his Supreme Court clerkship under Judge Hugo Black. His discussion of One View of the Cathedral and of his book Tragic Choices seems to me the most self-revealing. I quote, "There's a joke I tell. I say that professors write about what they are most troubled by. People will say, 'What about you?' And I answer, 'I write about subterfuges.'" He later defined subterfuges as a device that accomplishes a socially desirable end without making clear the calculus that produced that end. They are useful if dangerous lies. They are used to mask the choices implicit in the application of existing legal rules. I have asked Professor Silber to describe both the structure of the book and the nature of his and Guido's fruitful collaboration. The result is neither biography nor autobiography, but rather a particular take on oral history. I cannot resist the temptation, the analogy with a Talmud. In gray, we find Guido's narrative, his unmistakable voice, followed by, in white, commentaries, context, and at times revisions by Professor Silber. Most importantly, we find a portrait of a scholar, a teacher, and a judge who remained steadfast in his values, curiosity, and love for our democratic institution, it is the making of a great American who started as an immigrant from an Italian Jewish background. Thank you.
Thanks very much to Casa Italiana and to Centro, Primo Levi, Professor Albertini, Mr. Cassin, and all of you for being here. It is truly a privilege to be able to talk to this audience tonight. And your comments were just quite on the mark about the project and the way in which we tried to do something very different in this book. It is oral history, but it is not conventional oral history. It's an invented format that has a lot to owe to the Talmud, actually, because it's actually a conversation that involves a narrative voice and a context. And in structuring the book, there are 40 chapters and 4 parts. The first part is largely about Guido's Italian heritage. The second part is largely about his upbringing and his career as a scholar and a student. The third part is about his transformative work as the dean of the Yale Law School. And the final part covers his judgeship up to the present time. I'm fond of telling a story, which is that when we were talking about the book and what the title would be, originally I thought of the first volume as Outside and the second volume as In. But Guido said, that doesn't quite work because I'm outside and outside and in. It doesn't work, so why don't we give periods to it? So we called the first part Volume 1, 1932 to 1982, and I wanted the second volume to say 1982 to the present, and he said no, 1982 to 2022, because there could be a third volume. So in terms of the voice, Guido has what I call a semiotic memory. He has a ability to recapture the past in ways that are very rare. And so what I tried to do is take his voice and leave it alone, take my questions out. So I extracted my voice from the transcript and I removed them and amplified them in commentaries. So I call it a transplanted and amplified interviewer's voice, which is the technique that I developed. And so in that commentary, I tried to both document the things that he says, to provide a larger context, as Alessandro said, and then also to differ with him with respect to a number of different issues, where I think that his view is a possible perspective, but it's not the only perspective. So I chose a couple of topics that Guido and I might talk about if we have time. One of them is the divisions in the Italian Jewish community over fascism and the nature of fascism and the degree of anti-Semitism in Italy before and after Mussolini. The second topic is conversions.
We'll see.
We'll see what we get to. So let's get into it.
So this is wonderful. And what I'd like to do tonight is talk a bit about some things, especially about Italy and us in Italy, about coming to America to some extent, to see the early part. On the other hand, these books are about much, much more. And in different ones of these, we've talked about different things. Last week, we did the Supreme Court Historical Society, and it was all about the Supreme Court and Justice Black and having been in the Klan. So while I will be talking about earlier parts, because I think that's particularly relevant for this group, if in the question period you want to ask about anything, please do, because keep in mind that it is always one person. I was sworn in as a judge on the 55th anniversary to the day that we landed. That was not an accident. And what I am as a judge is still related to the things that I will be saying here. So let's start with Italy and with Jews in Italy and early on, and with my grandfather Ettore, who had been a self-made man for complicated reasons, had come to run and own the largest textile mills in Ferrara, was a moderate leftist. He had no problems with his unions because he took them seriously, and all the other business types were surprised by that. And he married into a family that was the largest landowning family, also Italian Jews, certainly the richest Jews, probably the richest people in the Ferrarese. And he was fiercely anti-fascist from the very start, before the fascists came into power. Ferrara was a center of fascist activity. Italo Balbo, who was from there. And so even before the March on Rome and before the fascists came into power, Balbo had enough control of Ferrara that he drove my grandfather and my grandmother away because they were too powerful in this little town as anti-fascists. So they could go anywhere, and they went to Florence. And there, he, because he had investments all over the country, would take trains and talk to other people who were giving money to the fascists because they were wealthy and they thought they could control fascism, and that fascism might be, oh, you know, this man is terrible, he's a crook, he's this, he's a fool, and so on, but we will control him, don't worry about it, and it will be fine. And my grandfather said, you are out of your mind. And he said that to everybody, but most especially to other extremely wealthy Jewish Italians. One particular example is Treves, the head of the Fondaria, the largest company. People who were immensely wealthy, they gave the money for the great synagogue in Florence, and they said, we must give money to the fascists. He's not anti-Semitic. Oh, occasionally people will say something, but we can control him. And my grandfather said, you will see. You will see. Because you cannot ever control somebody like that. And my grandfather died in 1937. So he died before the Holocaust, but he knew it was coming. He knew that this would turn, because if you support somebody who is evil, the evil will particularly come back, and he thought particularly come back to Jews. And, you know, his attitude about that was so deep that it shaped my father, even though my grandfather said one should stay and fight, and it was only after he died that my father thought that we should leave, and it shapes me even now in seeing all that is in the world. He was fiercely anti-clerical. And because he was anti-clerical, he was even anti-clerical with respect to Jews, because he always feared that the clerics would somehow give up the fundamental right for freedom. That was it.
Thank you. Can I just, one short remark? Can I have the microphone? Okay, no, that's great. Just for a little bit of context, you know, Ferrara is a very small city. And the fact that his grandfather had to leave because he was an anti-fascist and a Jew is particularly interesting because, as he mentioned, the great fascist figure in Ferrara was Italo Balbo. And Italo Balbo had a childhood friendship with Ravenna, who was a local Jew, and it was the only city that had a podestà, the equivalent of a mayor, who was a Jew. So I'm saying this just to give you a sense of how nuanced all these questions were. So in Ferrara, they had a Jewish podestà, but the wealthiest Jew, or fiercely anti-fascist Jew, Ettore Calabresi, had to leave and go to Florence because he was not tolerated there.
I would just add that the interesting part about what happened in the post-war period is that anti-fascism was certainly brought and highlighted. And one of the things that isn't often highlighted is the extent to which there was great disagreement in the Jewish community about Mussolini and the fascist party. And in fact, Jews were overrepresented in the fascist party as a proportion, at least in a number of communities. The number I saw, you can tell me I'm wrong, was point.
Maybe, if I may, it might have to do with the patriotism of the Jews. Italian Jews were in general, and correct me if I'm wrong, very patriotic. So that might contribute to a confusion of identifying patriotism with fascism. They were in one place they were overrepresented, and it was in the officers of the Italian army, especially during World War I. The number of Jewish officers were much higher than their actual presence in the country. So that might cause that generalization, because a lot of fascists were patriotic and nationalistic, but of course the two things are very different.
Yeah. And in that respect, Ettore was immensely patriotic. He was for the First World War, and even Italo Balbo, when Ettore was being attacked, said, "Don't call him a traitor. He was a patriot. He gave huge money to the people who were fleeing after Caporetto. He did all sorts of things. They were totally patriotic." And that says something, by the way, that meant to say about, I think it is difficult for Americans to understand the degree and non-degree of anti-Semitism in Italy before. Because unlike America, anti-Semitism, if there was any, was not ever social in Italy. After the unification of Italy, with the church being outside, Jews were socially the founders of a great yacht club with the great cardinal's family in Lago Maggiore. They were all the social positions that here in America there would have been. And yet the church was anti anything that was not Catholic. Now, not everybody, but there was that side. After the Concordat with Mussolini, that's when it became a little bit more complicated, because now the church is moving into the government. But that attitude that socially and in everything, and it's just this issue of religion that was a matter of anti-Semitism, that is hard for Americans, where, if anything, it was the opposite. As to religion, there wasn't anti-Semitism in America, but socially, enormous.
Do you want to add something?
Well, I think what I try to do in the comment in the book is to point to the disagreement, because there clearly is, intellectually in America anyway, a disagreement about the degree to which anti-Semitism sort of changed enormously. Everybody agrees that in 1938, after 1938, it was terrible, but the extent to which there was a problem, an anti-Semitic undertone in the earlier period, is open to a lot of scholarly debate.
And we had many conferences and lectures here on the topic, of the racial laws, and especially on contemporary historiography interpretation of the period. And the jury's out. I mean, do you find different opinion? There are some points.
Yes,
Alessandro,
no,
you want to give us the state of the art? Where is the scholarship now on it?
Yes, no, I mean, it's very difficult to make any generalization on this topic. But the remark that the Jews were overrepresented in the fascist party is simply not true. In certain professions, you were required to be a party member. And so some Jews did that. But even considering that, the hard numbers are that Jews were overrepresented in the resistance movement and in all anti-fascist activities. So I think that this is the relevant point. And quite frankly, you know, there were 1 out of 1,000 Italians were Jewish. And the Jews lived basically in cities from Rome up, you know, Florence, Bologna, Ferrara, Venice, etc., but not in the south. So they were concentrated in areas that are very specific, and they don't represent the whole Italian peninsula.
So I'd like to talk next about something rather complicated, and that is conversions. Who converted, why they converted, who did not convert, and what was going on there. Now, first let me start with just a personal thing. My mother converted to Catholicism, and even though her baptism came late, but she had become a Catholic quite early, and she had, because she decided at some point after I was born that she believed in God, and she felt that if she believed in God, she should belong to something, and that almost all intellectual Jews were not practicing because they were Jewish by tradition, but they weren't believers, and if they were believers, they were fully Orthodox. And that, for an intellectual lady, was very difficult. So strangely, she found a liberal Catholicism more open to that. Now, my father, who despised the notion of conversions, was fiercely anti-clerical and non-religion, accepted her because he thought, all right, she's wrong-headed, but that's a decent thing. He never respected anybody instead who converted for political, economic reasons. He thought that was cowardly. Well, maybe it was, but let's face the situation. In the Italian racial laws, as originally written, interracial marriage was not allowed, but if you were part of an interracial marriage and you yourself were converted, you could somehow, sometimes, count as not Jewish and therefore keep your property and continue to live in a way that was tolerable under these horrible, horrible laws. So what happened in my mother's family was because her father's mother was Catholic, minor noble, died in childbirth. So his father, Contini, married again, somebody who was Jewish. He was brought up as a non-practicing Italian Jew, but he could claim, especially if he had been baptized at birth, and who could say he was not? His mother, who was Catholic, was dying. There were priests all over. It seems very likely that somebody sprinkled some water over him, and the great Dominicans proved it. The result was that he could count as Catholic for keeping his property. But that meant that his children, even though they married Jewish, could, if they converted, also count and maybe keep that. And so he announced that everybody would convert. And so everybody else converted. Now, my father was furious. He accepted his wife because of that. And that happened way over in any number of ways. There were also some people who converted because they thought that then they could be treated differently. Giorgio del Vecchio, who was a fascist, president of Rome, friend of, well, in 1943, he walked into the Vatican and they accepted him, gave him a nice study and let him work because he was so much a right-wing fascist who converted. What happened to these conversions? It's very interesting because some the conversion took. Some the conversion did not take, but they never bothered with anything else because they didn't think it mattered. And so my great aunt converted. She couldn't have cared less about religion in any other way or anything. And then some reconverted later. And it's interesting to see how I have cousins in Pisa who, even though they then married people who were not Jewish, but who cared enough about the tradition, even though I don't know how religious they are, but they reconverted because they wanted to assert. And I think that says something about what was going on in Italy at that time. It was really unusual.
So let me read to you from my comment in the area of conversion. The racial law of 1938 restricted civil rights, banned books, excluded Jews from higher education and public office. Subsequent laws deprived Jews of assets, restricted their travel, and provided for their internment. For some Jews who had ancient roots in Italy but had minimized or de-emphasized them, the racial laws reawakened the spirit of solidarity of the culture and the religion of their parents. For many, it was a return, almost an initiation, and this recovery of traditional values signaled a decisive halt on the path of assimilation, a solution that had seemed inevitable in the pre-war years. For those who sought refuge in assimilation, on the other hand, there were essentially three options: to seek conversion through baptism, to qualify for Aryanization, which was a bureaucratic process of racial reclassification, or discrimination, is that how? An exemption that was granted to early or prominent fascists. So there were a number of routes that could be taken. And for some, I think it was a reawakening of traditional roots. And for others, it was a search for a different way to confront this really horrible situation.
I want to say something about the search of traditional roots, because I think that's not completely accurate. I think these people, even if they were not in any way religious, were extremely conscious of being Jewish and of those roots. Was it a snobism? Guido Tedeschi, who went and founded the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and who is a cousin, and in this family of his oldest, said, "We have been living off this snobbery for 2,000 years. This tradition, it's come home to root. I'm going to Palestine," as it then was called. Others had that, in that sense, but I don't think it's true that they weren't very much aware of that tradition. It did make them feel more conscious of the effects of it, but I think that the tradition was something there. And here, something very strange. My mother, in her old age, says, as I become older, I become ever more Catholic and ever more Jewish. Now, that can be difficult, but think in terms of something.
Guido, maybe I mean, you're in a unique position of being really, even today, still Italian and American. and of being Jewish and Catholic. I'm just curious if you could address a little bit the question of how, this idea of conversion, in a sense, it's an impossibility for some Jews. So the Jews in Italy who converted after 38 were deported and persecuted just as much as the others. But for somebody like yourself, you arrived here as a Jewish, baptized, thus Catholic family. In some ways, you've dealt with anti-Semitism there and here as if the conversion had not occurred. Could you just tell us a little bit about how that feels and how it is that people, in a good way and in a bad way, have seen you as a Jew?
I don't know. There are so many things to talk about, so I'll jump now to something else. And I'll jump. I thought we'd talk about the people who helped us during the war. I've written something, and I may publish a book about all the people who saved us, because no blood member of my family in Italy after 1943 was taken away. Husband, some was, but no blood member was taken away. And the reason was that people, amazing people, from the poorest farmer to some of the wealthiest people, risked their lives to save them. Now, I don't say, please be clear, that this was what all Italians did. We all know that there were people who did horrible things, who turned people in, and all that. And I don't want a statement, which I will do in this book, about the ones who did risk their lives, take away from that other side. But the people who did that should be recognized, because we must ask ourselves whether we would do the same thing. Which is why, in terms of this thing that I've written, it's a little bit of a problem, because all the editors want to hear more about my family. But I don't want to talk about my family. I want to talk about the farmers who stopped a train in which my uncle was trying to get south with his wife, 3 children, and my grandmother, and said, the Germans are stopping a train at the next station. Get out and we will hide you. And my uncle had to decide, were these bandits? Because here were people who were obviously wealthy, obviously Northerners, and incidentally probably Jews. That was the least important than the other. So they might have been saying them to steal. They got off, and they were hidden in caves for months by these people. Why? Why did the sister-in-law, the wife of the brother of Montini, a papal secretary of state, with a cousin whose husband had stayed and not fought and been taken to Auschwitz. She was being hidden by the Montini family, and she was approached by a German soldier asking her her fake name and identification, and she was rather batty, forgot it. And so the German stepped in, and Montini's wife said, she is a war widow, correct? And so is confused, and I am the sister-in-law of the Secretary of State. She could have been taken away. She was. Why? I don't know. Was there something in Italian culture? Was there something in the relation between Italian Jews and these Italians? And I can, there are hundreds, any number of wonderful stories. What was it? And would we do the same, which is not just being quiet and of course not turning people in, but actually hiding people, actually helping people when they are in that degree of trouble. Think about America. I worry, because I don't think any of us know what we would do until we find ourselves in that situation.
The only comment I would make about this is to perhaps enlarge it or contextualize it by saying that it is true that Italians did more on a comparative basis. At least there is some evidence. They did more to harbor and to protect than other parts of Europe.
Do you have another point that you want to go through with with your list? Yeah.
Oh,
You
yeah,
do.
we do have a couple of
Yeah.
other things. Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
don't know how
So,
much time we got.
Let me jump now to America. And after the war, why did we stay? Why did we not go back to Italy? My parents, who had not had an easy time of it, that's a whole part of the book, but ultimately amazing people managed, were undecided. My father, on the whole, probably leaned towards going back. My mother, even though women could have a better career in Italy then than in America, was more for staying here, because when she went back to Italy, she was so obviously a signora Finzi-Contini and all that. Oh yes, you want to do your academic things, and maybe you do them, but we all know it. So she was, but they were undecided. And so in many ways it fell to my brother and to me. And we both had the same reaction when we first went back to Italy. I'll just tell mine. To go back after the war and not be well off would have been terrible. But we went back and saw what, before the miracle of the 50s, it would be like to be wealthy in Italy. I went to Ferrara, and the driver of my father's cousin, the man who had saved his father, took me around in the family lancha to see the family lands. And we went along, and there was a little religious procession. And there was this twerpy teenager next to the driver, and the people in the procession saw the family car, looked at me driving by, and bowed and bowed. We went by a little church, and I said, "That's beautiful." And it says, "Yes, your cousin owns it. And the bell is in Ferrara because it is too beautiful to be here." I couldn't stand it. I was an outsider in America. I didn't want to be that in Italy. And my brother had the same reaction. And so we said, we want to stay and be outsider. Now here's the irony. We did not see in America all the inequality that was already there and would continue to be there, because blacks were basically unseen. They weren't seen. It wasn't even part of that in the 40s and so on. We knew, but we didn't feel in that same way the degree of division that there was in America. While in Italy, come 1950, and the great revolution of that, everything changed. So that in many ways, Italy became much more egalitarian than America. Let's be careful there too, because egalitarian has to do with degree of wealth differences, and I think Italy is more egalitarian than America, especially in terms of what the bottom has as a matter of right. Italy is still less egalitarian than America in terms of how people can move. I mean, move from one thing to another.
Yes.
While America we saw. So we stayed from the best of motives, even though possibly empirically we were wrong.
No, it's beautifully said. But I just wanted to, you have such a powerful phrase from right after the war. You say that you and your brother, and your family in fact, I mean, you had arrived in 1939. And after the war, you say, we were Americans. So this idea of how short a time it took you to feel American, it's a...
No, I am American, I am Italian. I am both. And that is something that you cannot understand. My work as a judge, you can't understand. I say some things today that make John Walker, with whom I teach, he's H.W. Bush's first cousin. How can anybody say that? Because it is so Italian. My wife, who is even more American than he, then looks at him like that and says, don't you worry about it. But I am both. I once was asked by a Pakistani who grew up in Sweden, who was a student, which are you? And I said, I'm both. And so he said, whom do you root for in the World Cup? And I said, of course, Italy. Not because Italy's playing well, but because soccer is Italian. But if it were baseball world, I'd root for America. And it's in that way that I am...
And it's not because you root for the winner.
No, I don't root for the winner, but I root for that which is that part of me.
So in this section of the book, I try to contextualize it in two ways. First, in terms of America, it's certainly true. And there's a lot of evidence that it was really Gunnar Myrdal's book, An American Dilemma, which began to awaken the white community to the existence of inequality in the black world. And so, but second, with respect to the decision to stay in America of Italian Americans generally, during the Great Migration between 1875 and 1928, there's a lot of evidence that as many as between a third and a half of those who migrated eventually went home and went back. But that's very different with respect to the return migration rates from Italy from the period 1946 to 1955. And in fact, that was an all-time low period in terms of migration back to Italy for people who had come to the U.S. And what I say in my comment is the circumstances in which Guido's family decided to stay were exceptional, but the ultimate decision that they reached was not.
Odd. I mean, some people did go back. Tulia Calabi, who was our first babysitter when we were in Rome, went back and became head of the Italian Jewish community in Italy. A great, great lady. Some did. Each one, I think, had to decide on the basis of their own personal relation here and what they hoped to do if they went back to Italy.
I have a question that I have been wanting to ask you regarding your teaching. You say that when you started teaching, and that was at Yale, you taught Introduction to Economics, correct? When you were at Yale Law, you were a student in the law school, and you were a teaching assistant, but you were teaching a course, and you eavesdropped some of your students that did not realize that you were so close, saying, he's a bit schizophrenic, but he's a great teacher. And schizophrenic, and then you tried to explain that after you took a class with a certain professor in the law school, you had a certain style, and then you took a class with another, and you had the other style. I want to know what is Guido Calabresi's teaching style. And tell me what it is.
Let me say that the story, I don't know exactly what my teaching style, but I will say something about my daughter who is here, and whose students, some of whom came to the law school. And after I taught one of them a couple of times, that student said, you know, you teach just like your daughter. Fortunately, I was quick enough to say, I think we both teach like my mother, which I think is true. So what is that style? The style is one never to put somebody down, always to ask of a person to do more than they thought that they could, to understand that if you try to fly, you will fall, but if you ever get off the ground, you will never be satisfied to walk again. The students I have are all capable of having ideas, and what you try to do is draw them out, so that then when they go out and do their things, they will do things which are genuinely original. And I see a couple of you here, and I know that that's what you do and have done. That's my style.
Thank you.
And it was my mother's, which is why she was such a great teacher. One silly thing, I was teaching economics when I was in law school. That class is the class of 1959, because I was 55. They are having their 65th reunion next year, and they've asked me to come and teach them.
It's wonderful. Thank you.
Guido, the book has the wit and the insight of your rich conversational style. It's really propelled by a number of stories. Could you tell me a little bit about your use of storytelling as a pedagogical tool?
Yes, as you can tell, I'm a storyteller. That's what I am, that's what I've always been, that's what most of my books are. So the question is, in teaching, do you tell stories simply to amuse and interest? That's a terrible temptation. What you have to do is tell stories that cause the student, when they go back over the thing, suddenly to see connections, which is why that story is relevant. So you have to, and by the way, this is what preparation for teaching is. People say, when I taught torts, which I taught for over 60 years, why do you spend an hour before the class preparing? It can't be that you don't know the material. The answer is, of course, I know the cases by heart. The question is, which stories will reach which student so that they will remember and think? And that's what preparation before class was.
I want also to go back to a methodological issue regarding oral history. And people might think that oral history is also history that is then rendered orally, like History Corps, the magnificent project with the Library of Congress. They have this booth, you go there, you record your story, and the way in which it becomes available is in an oral format. You listen to it. So already the passage from oral to written that you, as the interviewer, has to take upon yourself, and then the idea of coming up with different ways in which you present the result of your work. Like we heard, the book has pages that are gray, and that's where Judge Calabresi talks in the first person, and then there are the pages that are not footnotes. You deliberately don't put little numbers, but it's your own commentary, it's your own reflection on the things that were discussed during the... So, and I go back to one interview that the colleagues here at the law school had with you, and in which you talked about the decision when you decide to study either history or math at a certain point. And then you decide, math, I'm interested, I get it, I understand it, but I don't have the mathematical vision of it, right? And it's also something that comes up in the book. And then when it comes to history, you say, I love history. But in that interview at the law school, you say, I didn't want to deal with the primary sources. And there are lots of primary sources here. How is your relationship with the primary sources? Has it changed throughout the years? And what is your reaction of dealing as an historian, an oral historian, with the primary sources? What are the primary sources of an oral historian and how you reconcile them?
I'm a consumer of history, not a producer of history. I still read biography and history most. But with him, I guess I was a primary source.
You became the source.
I became a primary source, but it is not something that I like to do. Oddly, my brother, who became a doctor, because that's what he loved, but he could have been a great historian because he wrote beautifully, and he did like primary sources, which may have made him a better doctor. You know, lawyers ain't great at primary sources.
So I talk about this in the introduction, and what's true about oral history is that you are creating source material as an oral historian, and that's problematic if you're also the user of the source material. It's one thing for me as a member of the Columbia Oral History Research Office to take transcripts and deposit them for other scholars to use. It's another thing for me to take my own work, my own interviewing, and then to transform that into a product which is consumed by a retail audience. That's a different matter. And sort of theoretically, there is an oral history dispute journal, oral history review, where you will find contentious arguments about the right way to do oral history. To some people, it's sacrilegious to do what I did, which is to actually extract my questions, because people then think, and certainly if this were a courtroom, in Guido's courtroom, and if a court reporter were to extract the questions, from the transcript, we'd have a real problem, and I'd be thrown out. But what I decided to do was to take Guido's extraordinary voice. I didn't want footnotes to Guido, right? I wasn't going to have to sort of burden the whole narrative text with footnotes. That would have been sacrilegious. It seems to me much more appropriate for me to transplant my questions to commentaries, and that gives me a space. It opens up a space for me as a scholar to take ownership of the text. And so you have Guido's story, but then you have historiography. You have all of that going on. So that's my approach, and it's kind of new.
What are the reactions that you got from your fellow oral historians or historians?
Well, I'm still waiting for them. I can
But the
tell
book
you-
is doing very well.
Yeah, Alessandro Portelli, who's one of my heroes, who's at Rome Sapienza,
Yeah.
likes it very much. And he thinks that it's a kind of new dialogic form, and he appreciates it a great deal. Don Ritchie, who is the Senate's historian, his Emeritus, thinks it's great. But I still wait to see how the public at large. It hasn't gotten reviewed in the New York Times yet, and it hasn't gotten, the kind of public notice that it might. But maybe that's just because it's 1,000 pages long, and it's too new.
And it is completely new, and it's difficult to put in a category. That is also another...
Right. This is the point, that what is so wonderful is how Norman has created a new category. And he has done it, and he has developed it originally, and it is totally different from what anybody else has done. And if a reaction is of respect, this is good, but we don't know quite what it is, and therefore it doesn't fit in the category for this prize or that review or whatever, that is the best sign that this is something genuinely original.
I assume that most of the audience has not read the book. And by the way, there are copies for sale as you will walk out, and there's also a coupon with a discount for anybody who would like to purchase it online. But precisely because many people have not read it, I was wondering if you could provide us just a little bit of the kinds of things you didn't agree with or that you disagreed.
We should have some questions.
Yeah.
With the microphone, because I don't hear well, and it may be that I will need you to translate.
Yeah. The microphone? Yes.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering whether the book will be in translation in the foreseeable future.
Translation into Italian, I assume, right?
Yes, please.
Do you have any idea whether there's going to be an Italian translation of the book?
Well, I think it's very likely because Cassese, who did one of the blurbs, has said that he thought that it is essential to have an Italian translation, and he has been in touch with Mondadori, so I think at some point it is very likely there will be.
Sabino Cassese is one of the great Italian legal minds. He's a constitutional legal scholar. He was a member of the Constitutional Court, so his opinion counts for something. Yes, please.
This evening is especially special for me because it gives me the opportunity to say thank you for something you did for me almost 80 years ago. I was a new boy in a new school called Hopkins Grammar School, and I was miserable. And you saw me somewhere, and you came over to me because you saw how miserable I was, and whatever it was you said to me, you made it okay. And thank you, I've never forgotten that.
Being an outsider can lead people to be mean. There are many outsiders who do that. If instead it causes you to look out for others, it is the greatest blessing in the world.
Yes.
Hello, I'm so excited to read the book. I bought 2 copies. I'm just so excited. It's a wonderful evening. I had a question, Guido. Why do you think your grandfather, Ettore, like what made him, do you think, had this insight so different from his peers? Like what made him such an anti-fascist? Do you know much about that?
I think, well, there were many people who were anti-fascist because they saw both how evil Mussolini was and how the achievement that Italy had made of becoming a democracy was such a thing. What made him special was that he was willing to take chances and not just be a quiet anti-fascist. And sometimes that was specific courage, sometimes it was the banality of good, of just being in a, if I may tell a story. I asked my father how he became an active anti-fascist, how he came to be somebody who was jailed and beaten and so on. And he talked about the banality of good. He said, I was 22 years old, and the fascists had thrown out the president of the University of Florence because he was too tough and strong. And they had put in our teacher of anatomy or something, who was a good person, but weak. And so for the swearing in, we went because he was our teacher. And he gave a speech, and we applauded. And then the fascist minister of education got up and gave a terrible speech. And in the middle, he stopped for applause, as politicians will, and people applauded. And my father said, I didn't applaud. I didn't hiss or boo. We were much too polite to do that, but I didn't applaud. The person behind me said, next time, applaud, because there are goons taking down the names of people who are not applauding. He said, I was 22. If I had known that if I went and didn't applaud, I'd get into trouble, I probably would have stayed home. I might even have gone and applauded. But now I hadn't, and somebody said that. I couldn't do it. The next time he stopped, I didn't applaud. On our way out, the 4 or 5 of us who did not applaud were picked up and beaten. And I said, what did you do then? He said, we went to the fountain to wash. Why? We didn't want to go home bloody and scare our parents. did you do it to show you'd been beaten up? I said, I don't think so. But the fascists thought so. So they picked us up again, beat the tar out of us, threw in jail, and probably fed us castor oil and also. At that point, I was an active anti-fascist. The banality of good. What exactly was the same in my grandfather? I don't know. But now let me tell you a story. 60 years ago, there was the March on Washington. I was planning to go because I cared. But then there were killings, there were Congress ran, it looked very dangerous. Bianca was just a year old. I said, there'll be many people. I don't need to go. I can stay home. I shouldn't really risk it. That week, on the phone with my father, as I often spoke to him, he said, oh, this weekend I'm going to Washington. And I said, oh, why? He said, I'm going to the march. And I said, but it may be dangerous. I'm going. And so I said, I'm going with you. I thought he was very old. He was just in his 60s. But I wouldn't let this old man. And he said, I thought you would. And we went down, and it was a Sunday school picnic, the most wonderful thing, with thousands of people, black, white, this, that, all walking together. By the way, the speeches nobody really heard. I mean, they were great, and you looked at them after. But the thing was all of that. And that going made a difference to me and in my life. And I know my father was creating a banality of good of the same way that he saw, and I think he saw in his father as somebody who somehow, when they made him leave Ferrara, became even more active in that way. By the way, the person who asked that question is the widow of one of the greatest judges of our time, Bob Katzman, who was our chief judge, who was a person who really looked after people, and who, I've got to say, I'm so proud was my student.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Catholicism and the conversion, the idea of conversion, especially talking about some people maybe were Jewish by heritage, but in your case, obviously you became an active Catholic, and whether that was common or in your family, kind of it was all different types, and what kind of led you to that path as opposed to being more secular in nature?
It's a question about your own conversion and your relationship
Well,
with Catholicism.
Again, I was baptized and was brought up, I suppose, as a Catholic. I found most of American Catholicism really very unpleasant when I came here in any number of ways. And then I had the same kind of experience of my mother, that is, I decided that I believed in God. And just at that time, I went to England. And here again, these things are so strange. In Oxford at the time, the most intellectually interesting, and I must say snobbish, people were Catholics who were old Rhine Catholics from where back. And intellectually, I thought of what religion? I thought of becoming a Quaker, but I talked too much. And so it didn't work. And so I fell into it. In a way, I am more like my wife, who is a great believer in the Ernest heresy. But there is truth in all religion. Don't take any one of them too seriously. You should, if you believe, do something but be careful, be careful. I suppose that in my 90s, I could well say with my mother, I've become ever more Catholic and ever more Jewish. But I certainly become ever more Jewish.
There's a question back there.
I come from an Italian Jewish family as well. My father, Paolo Milano, who you knew, and our family arrived the same year you did. And he also was an anti-fascist during the 30s when he was in Italy. I think had a similar story to your father. And I just, if you'll forgive me, since you seem to like stories, I'd like to tell you a very brief story my father told me. That when he was in Italy during that period, he was being followed by a fascist policeman of some sort, and he knew it very well.
I couldn't.
And one day,
Just one moment,
is he
I need to
hearing
repeat
my...
it for the judge, for the understanding? He's the son of Paolo Milano,
Oh, you're a son of Paolo Milano?
and he's telling us a story of when his father was in Italy before coming here. He was being followed by a fascist secret police agent.
Just let me say, I think I have his tuxedo. How it got in the family, I don't know, but at some point from something or other. So if I find it and you want it, it wouldn't fit you, I can tell you're too big.
And apparently it was obvious to both of them that he was being followed, to both my father and at a certain point, this man who was following him came up to my father and he said, you know you're being followed, I'm following you. Couldn't we just reach some sort of an accommodation? Will you tell me where you're going? And I don't have to, follow you and figure it out. I can report back, and the whole thing would be much, much simpler. So I thought it was kind of a very Italian story, and I thought I would share it with you.
It is actually very similar to a story that you tell, Judge, that his father was being followed by these fascist policemen. He was aware of this, and the policeman was aware of the fact that he was aware. So he addressed him directly. You know I'm following you. Why don't you tell me where you go? So I'm going to do my things, and then I'm going to write my report. I'm not going to get into trouble. You're not going to.
Well,
there is a similar story.
Yeah, there is a story of that, of when my grandfather went to Florence, and he would take trains and talk to people and keep them and convince them not to give money, and so at a certain point he was called a corrupter of railway cars and forbidden from traveling. He went back to Ferrara for a funeral and was put in jail and then released. And the fascist head of Ferrara wrote to the equivalent in Florence and said, this man is very dangerous, he talks too much, he has the means to do it, you should have him sent to a concentration camp of the sorts that there were. And this went all the way to Rome, and David Kretzmer is the one who found that in Rome they decided not to do it because it caused too much of a fuss. He was too well respected and would cause, so even though he was in trouble. But at that point, they assigned a policeman to guard him. My grandfather, though very fat, loved to walk. And he would take long walks. And the policeman finally got tired, as with your father. He said to him, Cavaliere, whether he was a cavaliere or not, I don't know. Please, just take your walks. Tell me where you've gone. I know you don't want to put me in trouble. Again, remember, don't put individuals in trouble. Be kind to individuals, even if you heard of. And tell me where you've gone so that I give my report. That's very Italian.
Could have been the same policeman?
But no, I think it's something that is very Italian.
Yeah, I just want to return to this question about Catholicism and Judaism, because there is, I imagine I don't need to tell people who are Primo Levi this, but there is this tendency to conflate religious identity with religious practice. And that is, that's an issue. Guido was Jewish at birth as the child of a Jewish mom and father. Did he cease to become Jewish when he became Catholic at the time he was baptized or when he came back from Oxford? Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, Jews who join other religious traditions keep their Jewish identity as part of Am Yisrael, the people Israel. So I think it's well to keep that in mind. And in the course of my interviewing, I interviewed lots of people who were puzzled and perplexed by Guido's Jewish and Catholic intertwining. But it's really not so mysterious.
Thank you. And by the way, there are also histories of conversions from Catholicism to Judaism, and one in particular moved me, that ancestor of yours, that she converted after the death of her husband to Judaism because she wanted to be buried in the Jewish cemetery with him.
That's right.
Orsolina.
My grandfather's brother's wife, who wanted, Orsolina, as she was, who wanted to be buried with her husband, and so converted. And that was one reason. But there are other reasons. I have 3 children. One reconverted to Judaism. One is, I think, a Catholic, if she is much in the way I am, Virya. And the third one is a non-believer, for now.
There is this fluidity when there is the issue of religion comes up. I can only think about how fluid it seems to be. It's not a solid stone. It's like a thing in movement because
So much more interesting that that's the way all of life is. If we could think in terms of religion in the way we think about everything else in life, and how much more deeply. I'm going to say, in fact, in a few days, to people who are involved in the Catholic chapel, that if there's anything good that does, is that and all the different religious chapels, rabbis, and so on, are to make people who, when they come to college, start thinking about their faith as deeply as they do about the field that they're writing, and not keep their religion at a grammar school level when they become Nobel Prize-winning physicists.
Thank you. Is there any other question? I think we are going to go home with a lot of stories, ideas, and questions. And that's a good thing, that from a question, another question arises. I thank Professor Silber, Judge Calabresi, and Alessandro Cassin for a great evening. Again, grazie a lei. Thank you. Again, there are copies of the book upstairs. If you wanna buy one, I think our authors are going to sign it for you. Thank you.